Good to be with you this morning. Well, Steve said it well when he responded to my email about this Sunday's theme for worship. He wrote that cleansing the temple has a different ring to it during the pandemic. This is true. Our numbers are low for worship today, and that's proof of the pandemic. I thought of offering wipes and sanitizer as visual reminders for you, but we have this scene of chaos that Bonnie beautifully created for us this morning. Well, last Sunday, as Brian mentioned, we heard the story of Jesus' first miracle at the wedding at Cana, where his mother prompted him to change the water into wine once the wine ran out. The text implies that he was reluctant to do something attention-grabbing before his time had come. Well, today we leap into an entirely different look at the character of Jesus. Here he steps into a bustling place with seemingly no inhibitions. One wonders whether Jesus' mother would want to be seen with him now. I think of a child throwing a tantrum in a public space, and if you're the parent, you wish that you were anywhere but in that time and place. Considering that it's Passover festival time, we might say that this formerly partying, wine-making Jesus is now a total party pooper. He may have just ruined the holiday for the masses that are there. I was intrigued by this story as a child, mostly because we talked so much about peace and humility in church, and this story kind of rocked that particular Mennonite boat. Plus, I personally didn't have many examples of anger and rage, besides my own occasional tantrums or stormy teenage emotions, or what I saw in the movies. And yet, the anger that I learned to control or repress as a teen surprised me when I became a parent by throwing a party in my amygdala. Perhaps you've had anger surprisingly surface for you at some point, maybe throughout this pandemic, or due to grief or loss in your life, or an unwanted change like a loss of a job, or a heartbreak, or a struggling friendship. All that to say, anger is a real human experience. It's not a bad emotion, it's what we do when it emerges, and what it fuels us toward. Now, this dramatic temple scene is told in each of the four Gospels, which speaks to its significance to Jesus' ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke place it in Jesus' last days, which was probably more historically accurate. So we're left to wonder why John's account presents it as Jesus' first public appearance. Gail O'Day explains that only in the book of John are we invited to witness Jesus' glory in the miracle at Cana, and in almost the same breath to consider the challenge and threat that new life poses to the existing order. He goes from the guy you want at your celebrations to the guy you want to avoid, who makes you question everything you've ever known. Having this scene early on makes sense for John's gospel, which has a different flavor altogether. It may be chronologically wrong, and yet we can consider what was intended by its placement in order to emphasize Jesus, or God's incarnation in Jesus, early on. The gospel writer introduces Jesus to us in chapter 1 as the Word and Wisdom who was with God at the beginning, also known as Logos, or you might have heard it referred to as Sophia. And that mysterious cosmological wisdom comes alive in the flesh soon after that in chapter 2. We find Jesus following the instruction of his mother, helping the wedding celebration continue, going to Jerusalem for Passover, and then raging at a corrupt system. For a little background on the context of Passover, that festival was the ritual observance of Israel that celebrates Israel's liberation from Egypt, and God's provision in the wilderness. Festivals are mentioned 16 times in John compared to 2 to 4 in the other Gospels. So we can see John's depiction of Jesus is that he is an observant Jew, the festival-going Jesus of the Gospels. Jesus was there as an active member of the worshiping community. The temple is described in different ways, primarily as God's house. It was based on a pattern of a heavenly model. The inner chambers could only be approached by those trained in the proper purification rituals. The marketplace was the outer area, a large space used to sell items for the sacrifices. Children could play freely there, and it was a place for people to seek out day laborers, make legal complaints, and have religious discussions. It was essentially like a town square with religious flair. O'Day shares that it's important to place this scene in its proper religious and historical context. Cattle, sheep, and doves were required for burnt offerings in the temple. Since Passover was a pilgrimage feast, many of those coming to worship journeyed a great distance and would not have brought their own animals, so they needed to buy them. Similarly, the temple tax could not be paid in Greek or Roman coinage because of the human image on the coins, so they had to change their money to the legal currency in Jerusalem. So all of this we see was part of the worship culture, not necessarily the glaring face of corruption. It was a place of preparation and anticipation for the worship of God. So scholars are all over the place in what to do with this story. Is it to highlight Jesus' authority as God's son? Is it to shed light on the corruption of the rich toward the poor? Maybe both. These two theories seem to be intermingled in Jesus' passionate response. He questions the marketplace activities, authoritatively claiming it is his Father's house. Verse 21 says, "But he was speaking of the temple of his body." And it's noted that the disciples remember this later on after Jesus' resurrection. All of these things intermingled suggest an enormous shift where practices would need to change. God is not contained or confined to a place, a temple. God is not strictly accessible through religious authorities and sacrifice. God is intimately available. The dangerous reality for Jesus, then, was that he threatened the very system through which the wealthy and ruling classes of Jerusalem grew their wealth. So if we consider this temple scene at the end of Jesus' life, the dramatic urgency makes sense. But still, here we have the gift of viewing it as an ever-urgent thing. So in John, Jesus immediately confronted systems that create obstacles for people who desired access to sacred rituals. Or we might say, people who sought access to God and a sense of belonging as a member of God's people. So maybe, just maybe, this scene is placed at the beginning of John to show Jesus starting his ministry by confronting the systems and practices that he knew best. Reverend Laura Becker suggests that here Jesus is lamenting the whole system, for the system is no longer working. The system as it has been is no longer necessary. We in our community have this collective memory in our Anabaptist tradition, too, along with a history of resisting systems of abusive power. We also have a history of deciding who is in and who is out. Now that has changed from century to century, decade to decade, church to church. Still, we must acknowledge we too have had our own temple layouts and hierarchies of who can speak for God, who can do this or that within an institution. It's not just a temple or a church thing, it's a workplace thing too, a cultural thing, and so on. So I think this passage in John offers us some visuals for how we might practice living more authentically and intentionally in the way of Jesus. The words that stuck out to me from this passage, or the ideas, were remember, flip, release. First, the disciples remembered this scene later on, and they understood it much later. So my question for us is, what do we remember from our lives, from our faith history, that as we grow, we understand at a deeper level? What are the stories that we can gather and tell that spark change, that bear witness to change? And then second, Jesus was angry. He flipped tables to upset the order in a very literal way. So for us, what requires our energy and our zeal to bring about change? What stirs our anger? If that doesn't quite resonate, we might wonder, how can we educate ourselves to understand the anger of those who experience oppression? And if you just can't imagine your Mennonite self flipping a table, what might make you raise your voice? What would make your voice tremble, perhaps? Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to surface hidden tension that is already alive." And finally, Jesus released the doves from their cages, the animals, in the face of the corruption he saw. He cleared things out of the space. So for us, what needs to be released or cleared out, either personally or for us as a church body? What do we notice that's binding us to a system that doesn't serve the greater good? How does our church reflect things like capitalism or racism or militarism? You might remember those are the three evils that Martin Luther King Jr. named. And some have added a fourth to that, patriarchy. So in this temple scene, folks were profiting from the poor and benefiting from their continued poverty. And we know through the years, unfortunately, that is still a reality. I want to be sensitive to the fact that things are already really hard for us right now. There's a lot of tension in our lives. These things overwhelm. If this text is hard for you, if you react to Jesus' anger, if it's not speaking to you, I'd invite us all to look more broadly in the text and hold that dramatic scene with the tenderness of the Jesus who sat with strangers. He included outsiders, and he was intimate in sharing with his friends. Remember the theme in John that God is present, always present, in our anger, in our fears, in pain, in grief, in our bodies, in anxiety, all of these tensions. So maybe something from this passage is we are invited to remember our stories, to flip things that aren't working, things that need to change, and to release and clear out things in our lives. And we are not meant to be alone in this. God's house is a living, breathing, and spacious place for all. A spacious place for us to lay our burdens down to heal, to love, to be okay with strong emotions like anger, and to live more fully and passionately like Jesus. Amen.